Here is an overview of the suffragette movement, looking from 1903 all the way through to 1913. So this is what the story looks like. We have a few individuals such as the Pankhursts. We look at Prime Minister Asquith, this thing called the Hyde Park riots, Black Friday, the Cat and Mouse Act, and the two organisations and how successful they were. So we'll start here in 1903. In 1903, the women's franchise movement was looking particularly slow, with the actions of the National Women's Suffrage Society, which was run by Millicent Fawcett. Now, that was a suffragist organisation. Those were individuals who wanted to achieve women's suffrage through passive means. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst, a self-proclaimed suffragette, so a woman who wants to achieve women's suffrage through means of violence, created the Women's Social and Political Union, so the WSPU, which initially had a small number of members, mainly wives of independent Labour Party supporters, and Emmeline Pankhurst believed in deeds, not words. However, even up until 1906, no change was seen in women's franchise under the Liberal government. Then we have in 1905, Christabel Pankhurst, sister of Emmeline Pankhurst, felt it was necessary to increase the use of violence through disrupting meetings, demonstrations, and heckling at the government. She wanted to adopt the same methods used to petition for Irish Home Rule as those appeared to be successful. Therefore, she felt it was best to create pressure on the government to get them to act. So what the suffragettes did is they started to chain themselves to railings in Downing Street, and in October 1906 they broke into the lobby of the House of Commons and waved flags and made speeches for women's franchise. 10 of those women were arrested and sent to prison for breaking the peace. The upper class women were viewed in a positive light by other women and were used as a method of gaining increased support for women's franchise movement, because their actions kind of helped gain sympathy for the movement. But the working class women were the ones who were arrested here. And basically their actions weren't romanticised in the same fashion, which then led to an increased class divide between lower class women and upper class women. Largely, women supported the movement, however, due to feeling as if these women were unjustly punished and that they were living in a male-controlled state. So by February 1907, the actions of the WSPU had gained increased support for the women's franchise movement, which was crucial for the success of the NUWSS. Now, the NUWSS, just to reiterate, was the suffragist movement. But it was the actions of the WSPU that actually helped them to gain support. So what the NUWSS started to do is they started to arrange their own mass meetings. And that's what we have this Mud March in 1907. And here they were able to gain 3,000 supporters. But by 1908, it became apparent that the government was not listening, and the suffragettes turned to increased militancy. And newspapers started to kind of portray them as these quite violent individuals. And this is a quote from Punch magazine: "The suffragette that knew jiu-jitsu." So essentially they're being painted as quite like tactile, quite violent, quite aggressive individuals. By April 1908, it became even more apparent that suffragettes faced greater difficulties with the appointment of Liberal MP Asquith, who challenged the suffragettes and stated that he would only consider female franchise if he saw considerable demand for it. So he's saying that there's been no clear demonstration of considerable demand for franchise. So in response to this, the WSPU arranged the Hyde Park meeting in June 1908. And this was attended by approximately 250 to 500,000 people. Asquith still did nothing. So Christabel Pankhurst then encouraged women to start breaking windows of private properties to influence the government, to showcase this idea of increased demand for suffrage. Asquith also became target of these violent attacks. A number of these women were then arrested as a consequence, and they would then, in protest of their arrest, refuse to eat when they were imprisoned. The government then responded to this by introducing force feeding, so they would shove a tube down their throats and put food down it and force them to eat. This worked in favour of the suffragettes, as essentially it was seen as a heroic sacrifice. It paints the government in a really negative light because it shows that they're using forcefulness, but these women are seen as more heroic. Then a temporary discharge for Ill Health Act is published in 1913. It stated that women could be discharged if they were unwell and then rearrested once better. And this became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. It demoralised the WSPU members, but it increased public hostility towards the government. And the reason it's called the Cat and Mouse Act is essentially women could be released and then imprisoned again, released, imprisoned again. So it's kind of chasing them back and forth. Then in November 1910, the government refused to debate women's suffrage. The WSPU responded by sending 300 women into the House of Commons, and this became known as Black Friday. Police responded with great violence. They were rough and assaulted women, and this consequently led to increased acts of violence from women, such as arson. So examples of this were the letterbox bombs, where they would essentially put a bomb in a letterbox and then that would erupt. This increasing use of violence post-1908 created a huge amount of opposition for the WSPU, especially from the NUWSS. They felt women had kind of lost their upper moral ground through the use of violence. So we can see this increasing division between this sort of strive for women's suffrage. We've got the people who want to achieve it through peaceful methods, and we've got these people who want to achieve it through violent, active methods. It also created opposition from other groups, such as the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League, male opposition within the government. Upper class women started to look down on the WSPU. This women's movement, in some respects, started to gain quite a negative rap, so to speak, as people saw them as quite violent and aggressive. And also because there were divisions within the party, it also made it more difficult to further the cause. So that's kind of the story of the push for women's suffrage through the years 1903, with the start of the NUWSS and the WSPU, all the way through where we've got Black Friday, the Cat and Mouse Act, and increased opposition towards the women's suffrage movement.